Welcome to the All Things AI podcast. My name is Ishan, and this is the 23rd episode. Today, I am beyond grateful to have here with me a very special guest, Dr. Michael Hind, who serves as a distinguished staff research member at IBM, one of the leading tech companies in the world, but also a pioneer in generative AI. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me here today.
It's a pleasure to be here and pleasure to meet you, Ishan.
Yeah, I think we're gonna have a great discussion, so let's get straight into it. First, I just want to take a look at IBM and transparent AI because I think after I researched some of the work that you do at IBM itself, things like the fact sheet came up, and then I really just want to figure and learn more about that and take a look at the strides that IBM itself is making. So I saw that you lead the IBM AI fact sheet, which is kind of promoting transparent AI. So do you just want to tell us a bit more about what it is and its purpose?
Sure. So it's a project that's been going on for a while in the space of responsible AI. It's like a long time, but it's only about 6 years or so. And it started out to say, if we were going to promote transparency of the sort of construction, deployment, and monitoring of AI systems, what would we do? And this is not a new idea. Transparency exists in many, many industries. But for AI, the question is, well, what kind of information would you like to record, capture, and make available to who?
Mhm.
Um, and that's what a fact sheet is. Basically, a fact sheet is you can think of it as some kind of document. Doesn't have to be literally printed. It could be anything with the kind of information that its consumers want to know. Which leads to the next question of, well, who are the consumers? Who want to know about AI systems? And there's many different kinds of people. There's people who are potentially leveraging an AI system and reusing it in a new space. There's people who want to validate or even regulate or make sure AI systems are compliant. There's the user of an AI system, and then there's the affected user of AI systems. And all these people want to know different kinds of things, which leads to this sort of interesting problem of, okay, let's tie that down so we can know what kind of information should be recorded.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so I was also wondering, because you get a lot of data and information that you collect. So, and then the other step is actually implementing like the responsible AI practices themselves. So how does the work that you do with the fact sheet, like, I guess, actually be implemented into responsible AI practices? Maybe like flagging something and saying, hey, this isn't maybe a responsible use of technology, something like that.
Yeah, so there's a lot to the process. When you talk about sort of responsible or ethical use of AI, the first step is to know, well, what is happening in my system, right? Think about the responsible use of a car, right? Well, one thing we might want to know is the car going too fast, or how fast is the car going, right?
Yeah.
So the first step of that is to record that information, and then when you have the basic information, then you could start thinking about governing or controlling that for appropriate use. So maybe in some situations, traveling 50 miles an hour is perfectly fine on a highway, for example,
Yeah.
but on a urban street, it's probably not. So a lot depends on the usage. So the fact sheet idea is to record this information so that somebody with more context, somebody who can figure out what I want to allow and what I don't want to allow, can actually make decisions on the responsible use.
Mhm. And if you can, have you ever found a specific scenario where you think that maybe the technology that you're detailing on the fact sheet isn't specifically being responsible and ethical?
Um, Yeah, I don't think I can think of an example of that. I mean, it all really depends. Like, you give you an example. One of the things you can measure is the amount of, say, bias
Yeah.
in a system, right? So let's take a concrete example. We're creating an AI system predict if someone should be interviewed for a job or not, right? So
Mhm.
we have automation system, very sensitive, something you definitely want to get right and be careful about. And maybe it turns out that it recommends people of one group over another group. And there's nothing inherent about these groups that says, one should be more likely appropriate for a job versus another. I mean, a case where it might be appropriate would be like if you're looking for interviewing for an NBA player, and there are, group one is people above 6 feet, and group two
Yeah.
is people below 6 feet. Maybe that's appropriate, but there's many situations where it's not appropriate. Um, and so what you can do is you measure that mathematically what's the difference between those sort of approval rates of those two groups, and then use that information to make a decision on whether or not this is okay. And this is where it gets to be very interesting, and it goes beyond sort of technology. It gets a little more into social justice and ethics, and saying, well, what do we think is reasonable, right? So, for example, let's make it concrete again. Let's say I'm hiring for a position as a teacher, and I have males and females in my two groups, and we probably could argue you would think the rate should be about the same, right? Well, okay, well, what does about the same mean? Does it have to be exactly 50%? If it's 51-49, are we worried? Should we have audits and so on? And that's where it gets to be very, very challenging. So it's not a black and white question of it's ethical or it's not ethical. It really depends on a lot. And this is where laws can help. If laws can codify that 51 is not okay, then good. We can, try to abide by those laws. But right now,
Doesn't
it
exist.
doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And also with that being said, I want to take a look at just open source AI because when it comes to transparency, I think Google with TensorFlow, for example, making everything open source, the AI models that people can test themselves, it really is a testament to the idea that everyone themselves can get involved in this technology. So I also want to take a look at IBM because I know they have their own AI products with WatsonX, for example, which is the AI coding assistant. And so does IBM plan to make its AI research open source, like maybe even the code behind the models itself? And if so, can you detail exactly how that helps transparency and fairness in the AI industry?
Sure. So there's a lot of things in that question.
Yeah.
One, you mentioned TensorFlow. TensorFlow is a platform for creating models, which is very useful. Not necessarily a model in itself. So let's start at the beginning. What has IBM done in this space, in particular IBM Research, done in terms of open source? We've done a lot of things. So as I mentioned before, one of the things that's important when you talk about responsible AI is the ability to measure bias, right?
Yeah.
And so IBM launched back in 2018 something called AI Fairness 360, which is an open source toolkit of ways of measuring and also mitigating bias that is basically codifying what was done by the community. So some of the algorithms in there and techniques come from IBM researchers, my colleagues, and some of them come from the academic community, scientific community at large. And so before that happened, you had people writing papers, and occasionally there'd be an implementation with the code, but they were different implementations, and you couldn't compare one versus the other because the assumptions weren't always the same.
Yeah.
So by putting out this toolkit, it was sort of a level playing field and allows anyone to do deep analysis, comparisons, and so on. That was for fairness. We did the same thing again with many other things. Explainability, another important space in trustworthy AI. We did it for privacy. We did it for adversarial robustness and uncertainty quantification. So there's this whole suite of open source toolkits that have been out for many years now. That's sort of one answer to your question. The going to the models part, IBM just open sourced a family of Granite models, um, and not only open sourced the models, but also open sourced the sort of transparency about it. And you may be aware there's a Stanford has this thing called a transparency index where they try to
Yeah.
sort of grade different documentations of popular models, some of which are proprietary, some of which are open source. And they just recently updated it, and the documentation for Granite was at the top or near the top. So in addition to the description of what's there, there's also actually the code and open source.
Yeah, no, I think when it comes to corporations themselves, if we see companies like IBM, which are global leaders, actually prioritizing the ethicality of the technology, like you said, because now they're at the top of that index, I think that's exactly what we need because that pushes people like startups and everyone else also to follow in the same boat. Um, but I want to also take a look at profitability in AI because that's one of the biggest areas where I myself and many other AI ethicists have seen a clash because you look at the part and you think AI is a technology that you can make a lot of money off of, especially as it continues to get developed more and more, because there's so many purposes, whether that be like making videos, movies, or anything for that matter with generative AI. But at the same time, if you're gonna abuse that technology just to make money and go as far, make it so powerful that it's might be even dangerous with the content that it's generating, then that's not where this technology should be. So what can corporations do to benefit the ethicality of this technology while also making sure that they can make the money that they want at the same time?
Yeah, so this is a really important question and something that IBM has, I think, been a leader on.
Yeah.
Way back when, I don't have the exact date, but there was a really great write-up of this in the World Economic Forum, did a write-up about 2 years ago of IBM's sort of journey with ethical AI. But in there, they talk about the setting up of an internal ethics board, right? And this term gets used a lot. So let me just explain what it means in the context of IBM. It was a bunch of senior executives for IBM that would look at all uses of AI in IBM products. So exactly the kind of things you're talking about, and look at it from an ethics point of view of saying, okay, what is it doing? Is this something that we think we should IBM should be doing? Right, regardless of the profits and revenue and so on. Of course, when there is regulation, we comply with that. But this is going a step further and saying, is this something that IBM wants to do? And one of the very early examples of that was the facial recognition, where IBM, I think, was one of the first companies to decide, no, this is not something we want to get in, and they announced that, and then many other companies sort of followed along. So
Yeah.
that's so internally, that's what happens. I've consulted with some other companies who are trying to set up similar things, and it's a really hard, I would say, struggle. Exactly for the points you made, in that there's typically a business unit that's trying to be profitable, certainly, and then there's usually some kind of central organization that's trying to also be ethical, and that trade-off is a challenging one. A lot of it comes from I would say, the culture and DNA of the company,
Mhm.
of just what is your approach to this whole general space of ethics and fairness and so on. And I know I've been at IBM for many decades now, and it's something, there's a long, long history before AI, certainly, where we've been really on the forefront of sort of doing things that then the US government, in our case, would then make a law. IBM was sort of doing it before it was even a law. So that's, not maybe not a great answer. I'm just telling you the IBM answer, that a lot of it comes down to the DNA, culture, and the approach. It's kind of the opposite of, go fast and break things, I guess I would say. It's, be responsible.
Yeah.
The other thing that we're doing is we have a product, a leading product in the so general AI governance space called WatsonX.
Mhm.
And so this is basically tools, technologies of various kinds to help customers do this, right? So it's not an easy thing, and if you can have consultants and tools to help people, other companies do this and learn, then that can help them. So it's not just an IBM thing. It's, I think our impact will be even greater with helping a lot of customers. And there's a lot of requests that come say, "Hey, IBM, you have this ethics board. I heard about this. Tell us about your journey. Tell us about what you did and what we can learn and apply it to the culture of our company."
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly what we need to see because even with OpenAI, which is obviously fully focused on I think it was Ilya Stuvetsky left recently. He recently left the company, and then he was like a main like ethicist person at OpenAI. So, and then OpenAI says they're nonprofit, but obviously they're making a lot of money. And then there was this whole Sam Altman thing that happened, I think last year with him trying to, I think it was he was trying to get involved in some industries out of the United States itself, or at least they alleged that he was trying to get involved. I think it was with some telephone companies or something out of the country. But I think when you see that happening, we really need at least some people that can pivot towards having that responsible tech. I just want to follow up by asking, do you think like the government implementing legislation is what we need to see if we want like uniform responsibility?
So it's a complicated question, and there's many dimensions. So one I would say is, when you think about AI, what is AI? AI is, hopefully done well, is automation, maybe a smart automation of probably most often an existing process, right? So if it's an existing process, that means probably humans were doing it. And if it's important, then there's probably regulation on that process. So one example is hiring, we talked about, earlier, where there certainly are laws about ethical hiring and so on, regardless of who does it, right? So in terms of regulations, I think that IBM's position has always been let's look at specific uses. Don't just talk about regulating a technology. It's like regulating a screwdriver. It's can be used for regulating software, right? It could be used for so many different things. Regulate particular uses of that, right? So if you're talking about hiring, facial recognition, whatever it may be, um, that's sort of one thing. The other thing that's really, really challenging is there's a big mismatch between the speed in which two things happen. One is regulation, and two is AI technology evolving in terms of
Oh,
capabilities, right?
yeah,
And it's like the opposite, two ends of the spectrum, right? Where regulation, I'm not a policy expert, but from what I know, is that it takes a while to put into place, and the goal is hopefully it will last and be appropriate for a while, maybe 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Um, Whereas the technology is moving incredibly fast, month to month, week to week. And a great example of this is what the EU did. They were very fast, not very quick to, I would say, move on regulations.
yeah,
And IBM was part of that process. And then as they were getting close to the end of the EU Act, Gen AI basically hit in a very big way. And the approach they were taking, which makes sense, was this use case based approach. Based on, if you're doing this, then these are the requirements. If you're doing this, then these are the requirements. And then when Gen AI came along, it was, well, wait a minute, this can be used in a very general way. How does that fit into this use-based framework? And they
mhm,
had to sort of augment things at the 11th hour. And that's what you have now as the current regulation. So it's not an answer, it's just an appreciation for how hard this is.
yeah,
Um, and I think the other challenge too is when you regulate, it sort of assumes that there's an understanding of the appropriate things. I'll go back to my car example before, right? So, we have regulations in many countries for speed limits, right? Particular row, here's a speed limit. In the AI, what's implied there is we know how to measure speed, right?
mhm,
So
yeah,
speed is something we want to measure, and then someone decides, typically traffic engineers, what's safe and what's not speed for a particular road. In the AI space, there's not yet a universal agreement on what the metrics should be, right? So every kind of AI risk has its own potential metrics, and there's still sort of scientific debate on what's the best way. Like even just accuracy. How do you measure the accuracy of an AI systems? There's a lot of different things, right? So measurement's not clear yet. And then the next level is, well, what's a good or bad measurement? What is the limit? You haven't gotten that because we haven't really agreed on the actual measurements. So that's the challenge. I think even if we all could agree, yes, we need some magic regulation. Um, exactly what the metric is and what good or bad is not there. And I'll just mention the first example we have of this is in New York City. There's a New York City regulation around hiring, using AI for hiring. And there they actually said they defined a metric. They said this is the metric you should use. It's a bias metric, and the requirement right now is you should publish the values for your system. They haven't made a decision on good or bad. It's just transparency and the idea that hopefully, if your values feel bad to you, then you'll try to do something about it.
yeah. No, I think in the whole field, it's so hard for like just governments to find exactly how do you want to regulate this technology. I mean, I think part of it's that it's just a new thing. I mean, well, AI has been going on for like 30, 40 years now, but the fact that really AI coming to public prominence is something that we've only seen since like 2022, late 2022. So I think the government's obviously if regulating AI was an easy task, I think it would have already been done by someone at this point. But the fact that we're still waiting on something that's so comprehensive in the United States itself, I think, is really a showing up the idea that we need to find some sort of balance because I also like the point that you brought up about how AI is moving so fast that you might try and place like maybe like a stop sign or something, which is the regulation in that analogy. But by the time that you're going to place the stop sign, the technology, or I guess you could say a car, for example, is already past it. And I think that's really the issue that we're grappling with right now with the pace that the developments are coming at. And with that being said, I want to take a look at responsible AI on society in general, because in the first half, we explored really corporations and how they're being responsible. But I think the responsibility that corporations have also has an impact on society, because at the end of the day, the people that are using the technology, the people on the internet are the ones that are affected. And so with that being said, the first question is really just why does transparent AI technology matter? Like why should, I guess, someone that's just using OpenAI care about it, or OpenAI's ChatGPT? Because everyone knows that it's a cool tool, but why does the transparency matter?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's, I would say, two aspects to it, right? One aspect is for those who want to understand better um, whether or not the system, let's use bias again, is biased. Having access to the relevant information can be helpful, right?
Mhm.
So you know that's that's important. Another aspect is just, I think in general, we feel better the more information we have, right? So, the popular analogy to the space is nutritional labels, right?
Mhm.
Why do packaged food have nutritional labels and list ingredients there? It turns out to do that, it was over 20 years, believe it or not. Um, and it was because people were concerned that manufacturers were putting various words on their food, on the packaged food, and people weren't sure exactly what was in it. So then they said, look, there are people who are uh, diabetic or have different needs, and we need to provide more information for those needs. Now, does that mean that everyone who buys a packaged food is looking at nutritional label? I
No.
doubt it. Probably more so than it was 30 years ago. Um, but the idea is, so there's two parts. One is those who want to see it can see it, which is great. And then also it kind of is a little bit of a nudge on the manufacturer to say, look, you're going to be putting out this label, and maybe you don't want to have, potato chips with 300 calories, or all this salt or whatever it may be,
Yeah.
because you're putting it out there. So they talk about, transparency is, I think, the best disinfectant, or sunlight is the best disinfectant. It's that idea that it's almost self-policing. It's actually forcing you to think about, since I'm putting it out publicly, let's make sure I actually, do the right thing, and I'm proud of whatever the results are there.
Mhm. That makes sense. And the last question I want to ask at this point is really focusing on AI transparency and also intertwining that with the United Nations and organizations like that. Because there's people that are giving testimonies in Congress, in the UN right now about AI and how we should regulate it in the future. So I just want to ask lastly, how can organizations as high as the United Nations work with corporations and AI developers and research scientists to create mutually agreeable development guidelines for AI technology?
Yes, so great question. It's very hard. One of the challenges when you're talking about sort of regulating AI or nudging AI is the mismatch in terms of knowledge, right? And on one hand, it matters. One hand, it doesn't matter, right? So why does it maybe not matter? Well, if you're talking about regulations or the UN or whatever, principle, you have these principles of how society should work, and AI is just a technology, right? So if you have these principles, you can say, all right, these principles should be satisfied, and no matter how you go about doing it, make sure you satisfy these principles. So it's agnostic to how things work, right?
Mhm.
On the other hand, um, having some awareness of how the technology works can help you, right? So just going back a little bit, if you think about, how AI works, and AI is a very broad term, but I'm talking about machine learning, or
Yeah.
deep learning, right? It works not by explicitly writing any rules, writing any code, or anything like that, right? So no one is programming in bias or hallucinations or whatever it may be. It learns the technology is created by learning patterns, right? Learning patterns in data, right? So that's the magical part, that you don't have to program it. The next question is, well, what is it? The reason it works is because these patterns seem to come up over and over again, and that's good. But it also learns some bad patterns, particularly with historical data. So
Yeah.
why do I say that? I say that because if you're thinking about regulating AI, one of the things that was quite popular for a while was an AI system should be able to explain how it got to its decision. And that seems
Mhm.
quite reasonable, right?
It does.
But but in reality, the way the system works is no one really knows how it is working, why it came to a decision. Include the very smart people building the system, right? So you could say, well, no, we demand explanations, and if this technology is incapable of giving it, then that's it, bad news.
I
But I
think
think,
I
yeah,
think at that point it's like, how is it supposed to explain what it's the decision? That's the other thing. How does it learn to explain that? Because then there's like it's like a loop almost now that I think about it.
yeah. In fact, this was what got me into this area about 7 or 8 years ago. Was there was legislation that actually said what I just said, um, and my question back was, well, what is an explanation? Like, how would you, if I gave you an explanation, is that satisfying to you? Like, you say you need to explain it, and then there's a thought experiment you can do, and you can say, well, is it the case, which I thought it was true, that all real important decisions we get an explanation, right?
Mhm.
It seems like that would be, and then you can go through a few examples where that's not the case. Like in the current news, jury decisions, there's not an explanation for why someone was guilty or not guilty.
They
That's
just
a pretty high stakes situation, right?
yeah,
When you apply to college or to a job and you get rejected, no one gives you a reason,
yeah.
right? So I'm not saying that's the way the world should be. I'm just saying that when we have these requirements for AI, we should sort of balance and understand what that means, what the implications mean for the technology, and also wonder if that are we applying the same standard for humans and other processes as well.
Yeah. I think I really like two things. I think the way that I really like the way you talked about like the humans themselves, because I think if you compare the performance that humans have to the AI models, that's like because at the end of the day, how I like to think about AI is like it's kind of like the basis of AI is neurons and how they can basically function like a brain and learn everything. So on that note, I think comparing it and giving it similar standards to humans, although there are obviously differences because one is a computer and the other's living and has emotions and everything, but that's a whole nother debate. But I think using or extrapolating the similar standards and maybe changing them a bit based on what system you're using is really good. And also like the point you made about exactly how because we can't really force the AI to make a decision or explain how it's making its decision. Because at that point, it's like if AI is having a high enough accuracy or it's making a judgment similar to a human, but it can't exactly explain it. I think at that point, we're seeing that the technology is really catching on to the same way that people are doing things. And it probably is a trustworthy source at that point. But yeah, I guess with that being said, that's all I had planned for today's interview. And it's great having a conversation with you.
Great. Yeah, it's been my pleasure too. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And for anyone watching this, make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and comment down below.